is a video lesson on how to add and subtract vectors. Adding and subtracting vectors. So to add vectors, we use a method called triangle law of vector addition, which is basically adding vectors by taking the head of one vector and putting it to a tail of the other vector. So if we look at an example of the vector, an example of vector right here, vector A, and another vector going like this, and that is called vector B. And you wanted to add these two vectors. Well, the triangle law of vector addition is basically making a triangle out of these vectors. So let's say the question's asking to find vector A plus vector B. Now to find vector A plus B, we must add these vectors. And the trick to adding these vectors is taking the head of one vector and adding a tail to the other. So for example, it says find, if it's asking to find this, first we'll take vector A, and you notice how this is the head of vector A is right over here, and the head of that will be attached to the tail of B. So that is vector B. So you notice that vector A, the head of vector A is attached to the tail of vector B. And now to find the resulting vector, which is vector A plus vector B, it always connects from the starting location to the ending location. So if we label this as C, A, B, the resulting vector will go from C, the tail will go from C, and the head will be at B. As you see, the reason for this is because the original vector A started from C and vector B ended at B. So the resulting vector will go from the starting point to the end point. Let's look at more examples. For example, if we have vector A going like this, and let's put a vector B going like this, and a vector C going down like this. And for example, let's say the question asks to sketch vector B plus vector A. So we must first draw vector B right here. And we know the question's asking to find vector B plus vector A, or draw vector B plus vector A. So now that we drew vector B, we are going to add vector A towards vector B. And remember, for adding vectors, it's from head to tail. So as you see, the head of vector B will be attached to the tail of vector A like this. And the resulting vector, once again, it connects from the starting location to the end location. As it started from the tail of B, it will end at the head of A, and that is called vector B plus vector A. Let's look at another example. Let's say the question asks us to sketch vector B plus C. So once again, it's asking us to start with vector B, and once again we're adding vectors. So the head of the B will be attached to the tail of C. We notice C is going down, like this. So as c goes down, we know the resulting vector is from the starting point to the end point, as it starts from B and it's at C. And this vector is called vector B plus C. So overall, when adding vectors, just remember you're adding the head of one vector to the tail of the other, and the resulting vectors from the starting point to the ending point. Now let's look at subtracting vectors. So basically, when subtracting vectors, example would be let's use the same vectors as we previously used. So if this is vector A and this is vector B, we are basically trying to find, we are subtracting vectors, so we'll do vector A minus vector B. This is also equal to vector A plus negative vector B, which basically means where the magnitude of B is the same, but the direction is different. So if we have vector A like this, we know that vector B would initially, if we were adding vectors, would go like this. But since we're subtracting vectors, we would ultimately flip vector B, so it would come down like this. As it has the same magnitude, we're just subtracting it by flipping its direction. So, which basically is the opposite of the original. So remember, the resulting vector is always the same, as it starts it starts from the starting point of the original vector and ends at the end point of the other. So it starts from the tail of A and ends at the head of B, and then it will be called vector A minus vector B. The key thing with subtracting vectors is remembering to find the opposite side of the vector that is being subtracted, and in this case it was vector B. And also remember that the resulting vector is the exact same as with vector addition, where the vector connects from the starting location to the end location. So now let's look at something called the zero factor. So the zero factor is basically a vector with the magnitude of 0 and an uncertain direction. So what does that ultimately mean? So if we look at an example of adding multiple vectors, as we say, vector A plus vector B plus vector C, and then if vector D goes back like this, you can just see that the ending point is where the starting point was, as we started from the tail of vector A and ended at the tail of vector A. So the zero factor is where all of these vectors are added. The magnitude is 0 because we came back to the same location we started at. Now let's look at an example taking all these factors in. So the magnitude of vector x is equal to 9 and the magnitude of vector y is equal to 12. If the angle between these vectors is 90 degrees, determine the magnitude of vector x plus y and calculate the angle between vector x and vector x plus vector y. So we can first say that we are only given the magnitudes of these vectors and there's no direction. So ultimately we can start by just drawing whatever direction we would like. So we can draw vector x with the magnitude of 9 going up, and we know that the angle between these vectors is 90 degrees, so angle y will be straight down like this. Vector y, sorry, will go straight to the right like this with the magnitude of 12, and we know that the angle between them is 90 degrees. And it's asking us to determine the magnitude of vector x plus vector y. Well, we learned that when adding vectors, it must be from the head of one vector to the tail of the other. So, since vector x is first, we'll use the head of vector x and add vector y to it right here. That is vector y, and that is 12. So now that we have added these two vectors, we know that the resulting vector connects from the starting location to the end location. So we know the starting location was at the tail of vector x, and the ending location is at the head of vector y. This is vector x plus vector y. So, and we also know this is 90 degrees, since the angle between the vectors is 90 degrees. So, with all this being said, to find the magnitude of vector x plus vector y, we can use Pythagorean theorem, where we can say that the magnitude of vector x plus y, magnitude x plus vector y, is equal to vector x squared, the magnitude of vector x squared, plus the magnitude of vector y squared. And we can say that 9 squared plus 12 squared is equal to this, and then we can go on forward and solve this, where the answer will come down to getting the root of 12 squared plus 9 squared, which is 225, and so that means the magnitude of the resulting vector is 15. But we are not quite done yet. It's also asking us to find the angle, and theta would be located right here. Now to find the angle, we can just use SOHCAHTOA, and we're going to use TOA since we have opposite over adjacent. So that means tan theta equals 12 over 9, and theta equals tan inverse of 12 over 9, which theta would ultimately equal 53.1 degrees. So that is an example of addition of vectors, and there are examples of subtraction of vectors and zero vectors. So please feel free to try the quiz, which is actually a game that follows up as an activity, and thank you for watching.